Saint Augustine on Christian Doctrine, Book 2, Chapter 8, the Canonical Books. But let us now go back to consider the third step here mentioned, for it is about it that I have set myself to speak and reason, as the Lord shall grant me wisdom. The most skillful interpreter of the sacred writings, then, will be he who in the first place has read them all and retained them in his knowledge, if not yet with full understanding, still with such knowledge as reading gives, those of them at least that are called canonical. For he will read the others with greater safety when built up in the belief of the truth, so that they will not take first possession of a weak mind, nor cheating it with dangerous falsehoods and delusions, fill it with prejudices adverse to a sound understanding. Now, in regard to the canonical scriptures, he must follow the judgment of the greater number of Catholic churches, and among these, of course, a high place must be given to such as have been thought worthy to be the seat of an apostle and to receive epistles. Accordingly, among the canonical scriptures he will judge according to the following standard: to prefer those that are received by all the Catholic churches to those which some do not receive. Among those again which are not received by all, he will prefer such as have the sanction of the greater number and those of greater authority, to such as are held by the smaller number and those of less authority. If, however, he shall find that some books are held by the greater number of churches and others by the churches of greater authority, though this is not a very likely thing to happen, I think that in such a case the authority on the two sides is to be looked upon as equal. Now, the whole canon of Scripture on which we say this judgment is to be exercised is contained in the following books: 5 books of Moses, that is, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy; 1 book of Joshua the son of Nun; 1 of Judges; 1 short book called Ruth, which seems rather to belong to the beginning of Kings. Next, 4 books of Kings and 2 of Chronicles. These last not following one another, but running parallel, so to speak, and going over the same ground. The books now mentioned are history, which contains a connected narrative of the times and follows the order of the events. There are other books which seem to follow no regular order and are connected neither with the order of the preceding books nor with one another, such as Job and Tobias and Esther and Judith, and the 2 books of Maccabees and the 2 of Ezra, which last book more like a sequel to the continuous regular history which terminates with the books of Kings and Chronicles. Next are the prophets, in which there is 1 book of the Psalms of David, and 3 books of Solomon, viz., Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. For 2 books, one called Wisdom and the other Ecclesiasticus, are ascribed to Solomon from a certain resemblance of style, but the more likely opinion is that they were written by Jesus the son of Sirach. Still they are to be reckoned among the prophetical books, since they have attained recognition as being authoritative. The remainder are the books which are strictly called the prophets, 12 separate books of the prophets which are connected with one another and having never been disjoined are reckoned as one book. The names of these prophets are as follows: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Then there are the four greater prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Ezekiel. The authority of the Old Testament is contained within the limits of these 44 books. That of the New Testament, again, is contained with the following 4 books of the Gospel, according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke, according to John. 14 epistles of the Apostle Paul, 1 of the Romans, 2 of the to the Corinthians, 1 to the Galatians, 2 the Ephesians, to the Philippians, 2 to the Thessalonians, 1 to the Colossians, 2 to Timothy, 1 to Titus, to Philemon, to the Hebrews, 2 of Peter, 3 of John, 1 of Jude, and 1 of James, 1 book of the Acts of the Apostles, and 1 of the Revelation of John. How we should proceed in studying Scripture. In all these books, those who fear God and are of a meek and pious disposition seek the will of God. And in pursuing this search, the first rule to be observed is, as I said, to know these books, if not yet with the understanding, still to read them so as to commit them to memory, or at least so as not to remain wholly ignorant of them. Next, those matters that are plainly laid down in them, whether rules of life or rules of faith, are to be searched into more carefully and more diligently. And the more of these a man discovers, the more capacious does his understanding become. For among the things that are plainly laid down in Scripture are to be found all matters that concern faith and the manner of life, to wit, hope and love, of which I have spoken in the previous book. After this, when we have made ourselves to a certain extent familiar with the language of Scripture, we may proceed to open up and investigate the obscure passages, and in doing so draw examples from the plainer expressions to throw light upon the more obscure, and use the evidence of passages about which there is no doubt to remove all hesitation in regard to the doubtful passages. And in this matter, memory counts for a great deal. But if the memory be defective, no rules can supply the want. Chapter 10. Unknown or ambiguous signs prevent Scripture from being understood. Now there are 2 causes which prevent what is written from being understood: its being veiled either under unknown or under ambiguous signs. Signs are either proper or figurative. They are called proper when they are used to point out the objects they were designed to point out, as we say bos when we mean an ox, because all men who with us use the Latin tongue call it by this name, bos. Signs are figurative when the things themselves, which we indicate by the proper names, are used to signify something else, as we say boss, and understand by that syllable the ox, which is ordinarily called by that name. But then further by that ox understand a preacher of the gospel, as Scripture signifies, according to the Apostle's explanation, when it says, "You shall not muzzle the ox that treads out the grain."